It was a quiet Thursday evening in Crestwood, a sleepy suburban town where the loudest noises were usually chirping crickets or the occasional bark of a restless dog. Officer Mark Trenton was on patrol, driving his usual route through the narrow streets lined with well-kept houses. The town's relative calm meant that Mark's nights were often uneventful, save for the rare noise complaint or a broken taillight. Tonight, though, something felt different, an unease he couldn't quite shake. As he drove past a local park near the edge of town, Mark noticed a small group of teenagers huddled near a bench under a flickering streetlight. The park was technically closed after sunset, and the sight of a few bottles glinting in the moonlight made him sigh. Underage drinking, he muttered to himself, pulling over. He turned off his engine and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel path. "All right, kids," he called out, his voice carrying an authoritative edge. "Park's closed, and you know better than to be drinking out here. Let's wrap it up and head home." The teens froze for a moment, then scrambled in different directions, clearly not wanting to deal with the law. But one girl remained, sitting on the bench with her arms crossed. She looked small and defiant, her dark hair framing a face that was trying hard to mask fear with irritation. "You deaf or just stubborn?" Mark asked, walking closer. He noticed the beer bottle on the ground near her feet and picked it up. "You know this isn't allowed, right?" The girl looked up at him with piercing eyes, and for a moment, Mark felt unsettled. She didn't seem like the usual rebellious teenager he encountered. There was something about her calm yet defiant demeanor that set her apart. "I'm not drunk," she said flatly. "And I'm not going anywhere." Mark sighed, glancing back at his patrol car. "Look, I don't want to make a scene here. Just tell me your name, and I'll give you a warning." The girl didn't respond. Instead, she looked past him as if he were invisible, her gaze fixed on the dark woods beyond the park. Annoyed, Mark stepped closer, towering over her. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his tone sharp. That's when he heard the voices, a group of older boys emerging from the woods, laughing and shouting. One of them called out, "Hey, Emma, you good?" "Who's this, your babysitter?" The girl, now identified as Emma, visibly tensed. Mark turned to face the boys, sizing them up. They were older than Emma, probably in their early 20s, and their swagger suggested they'd had more than a few drinks. One of them, a burly guy with a buzz cut, walked up to Mark, his breath reeking of alcohol. "What's the problem, officer?" he slurred. "We're just having a little fun." "This park is closed, and you're all trespassing," Mark replied, his hand resting on his belt. "Time to head home before this turns into something you'll regret." The buzz-cut guy smirked. "Oh, come on, man. Don't be such a hard ass. We're just kids." Mark ignored the comment and turned back to Emma. "You with them?" he asked, pointing toward the group. Emma didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Frustrated, Mark felt his patience wearing thin. He bent down and picked up the beer bottle, holding it up for emphasis. "This yours?" he asked. Emma finally looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "No," she said quietly. "But does it matter? You've already decided it is." Her words hit a nerve. Mark wasn't used to being talked back to, especially by someone so young. The buzz-cut guy laughed behind him. "Ooh, looks like she's got you there, officer." Without thinking, Mark turned toward the group, raising his voice. "That's enough. All of you, out of here now." His tone silenced the laughter, but the tension in the air thickened. The boys began to back away reluctantly, muttering curses under their breath. Mark turned his attention back to Emma, who was still sitting on the bench, her arms crossed defiantly. "You too," he said, his voice softer now but still firm. "Go home." "I told you," Emma said, standing up slowly. "I'm not drunk. And I'm not going anywhere." Mark clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. He held up the beer bottle. "You're going to tell me this isn't yours while you're sitting here, in the middle of this mess? Do you think I'm stupid?" Emma's calm facade cracked for the first time. She stepped forward, her voice rising. "No, I think you're a bully who can't handle a girl standing up to him." The word stung, and Mark, now completely exasperated, made a choice he would regret. He held the beer bottle out toward her, shoving it close to her chest. "Fine," he said, his voice low and threatening. "If you're so innocent, let's see you explain this to your parents." Emma's eyes widened, not with fear, but with a cold fury that caught Mark off guard. She stepped back, her hands trembling as she pushed the bottle away. "You don't know who you're messing with," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet menace. "You have no idea." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Mark stared at her, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. Who was this girl? And why did her words send a chill down his spine? Before he could respond, a voice crackled through his radio. "Unit 12, we've got a disturbance reported at Cedar Avenue. Can you respond?" Mark hesitated, his eyes still locked on Emma. She held his gaze, unflinching, as if daring him to push further. Finally, he stepped back, lowering the bottle. "Go home," he said one last time before turning and walking back to his patrol car. As he drove away, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something about the girl, her defiance, her words, her calm yet fiery presence, left him unsettled. And as the night stretched on, he would come to realize just how right she was. He truly had no idea who he was messing with. The next morning, the small town of Crestwood buzzed with the usual rhythms of daily life, commuters rushing to work, parents dropping kids off at school, and retirees enjoying their morning coffee at the diner. For Officer Mark Trenton, however, the routine felt fractured. The previous night's encounter with Emma lingered in his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. He replayed the moment over and over, her defiance, her words, and most of all, the cold certainty in her voice when she warned him. It wasn't fear he'd seen in her eyes, it was something else, something that unnerved him. As Mark sat at his desk in the station, sipping lukewarm coffee, his partner, Officer Dave Carter, walked in. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," Dave said, plopping into the chair across from him. Mark shrugged. "Long night. Anything interesting?" Dave asked, raising an eyebrow. Mark hesitated, debating whether to mention the incident. Mark picked up the phone, his stomach sinking as he saw the video. It was shaky and dimly lit, clearly filmed from a distance, but it showed enough. The clip captured him standing over Emma, holding the beer bottle and shoving it toward her. The audio was muffled, but Emma's voice rang out clearly, "You don't know who you're messing with." Mark's jaw tightened as he set the phone down. "Who filmed this?" "Looks like one of the kids," Harris said. "It's been making the rounds on social media since this morning. People are calling it an abuse of power. The mayor's office has already been contacted." Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what it looks like," he said. "She was being disrespectful, and I was trying to make a point." Harris raised an eyebrow. "A point? By shoving a beer bottle in her face?" "I wasn't," Mark began, but Harris cut him off. "Listen, Mark. I know you've been on the force a long time, and I know you've got a good record. But this doesn't look good. The chief wants you on desk duty until we figure this out." Mark stared at him, anger bubbling under the surface. "Desk duty? For what? A misunderstanding?" Harris leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "For optics, Mark. The town's already split on how we handle things, and this just poured gasoline on the fire. Take some time to cool off. Let us handle the fallout." Mark stormed out of the office, his mind racing. He knew the video painted him in a bad light, but what bothered him more was Emma's warning. What did she mean when she said he didn't know who he was messing with? And how had a simple encounter spiraled so quickly into chaos? That evening, Mark sat at home, scrolling through his phone. The video was everywhere, shared, commented on, dissected by strangers who didn't know him. Some defended him, arguing that teenagers needed to respect authority. Others condemned him, calling him a bully and demanding his resignation. The divide was stark, and Mark felt trapped in the middle, unable to explain himself. As he read through the comments, a knock at his door startled him. He opened it to find a man in a crisp suit standing on his porch. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that made Mark instantly wary. "Officer Trenton?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes," Mark replied, narrowing his eyes. "Who's asking?" The man extended a hand. "James Hayes. I believe you met my daughter last night." Mark froze. The name clicked immediately. Hayes. He'd heard the name before, though he couldn't place it. Hesitantly, he shook the man's hand. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hayes?" James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I think it's more a question of what I can do for you, officer." "May I come in?" Mark stepped aside, his mind racing. James walked into the living room, his movements deliberate and composed. He glanced around briefly before taking a seat. "Let's cut to the chase," James said, his tone cool. "You crossed a line with my daughter last night." Mark bristled. "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, your daughter was in the park after hours, drinking with a group of boys. I was doing my job." James tilted his head slightly. "Was it your job to intimidate her? To shove a bottle in her face? Or was that just your way of asserting control?" Mark's fists clenched. "I didn't hurt her." "No," James agreed, his voice dangerously soft. "But you left her shaken, humiliated, and afraid. And for that, there will be consequences." Mark stared at him, struggling to contain his frustration. "I'm already facing an investigation," he said. "What more do you want?" James leaned forward, his expression hardening. "What I want, Officer Trenton, is accountability. You see, I've spent my entire life serving this country, protecting people like you, and ensuring that justice prevails. But when someone like you abuses their power, it undermines everything I stand for." Mark's stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. James Hayes. He wasn't just Emma's father, he was a retired general, a decorated war hero whose name carried weight far beyond the borders of Crestwood. "I didn't know who she was," Mark said quietly, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "That's the problem," James replied, standing up. "You didn't bother to know. You saw a teenage girl and assumed you could treat her however you wanted. But let me make one thing clear, Officer Trenton, this isn't over." With that, James turned and walked out, leaving Mark standing in stunned silence. For the first time in his career, Mark felt genuinely afraid, not of losing his job, but of what might come next. Emma's warning echoed in his mind, "You don't know who you're messing with." And now, he was beginning to understand just how true that was. The days following James Hayes's visit were a blur of anxiety and uncertainty for Mark Trenton. The video of his encounter with Emma continued to spread, now bolstered by rumors and commentary that painted him as the villain. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of the community's eyes on him, some glaring in judgment, others filled with curiosity. Even his colleagues at the station seemed more distant, their usual camaraderie replaced by awkward silences and forced politeness. Mark had always prided himself on being a respected officer in Crestwood, but now, his reputation felt like it was crumbling beneath him. Despite the tension, Mark tried to carry on with his desk duties, drowning himself in paperwork to avoid thinking about the storm brewing around him. But it was impossible to ignore. The phone calls came in waves, angry residents demanding answers, reporters fishing for a soundbite, and even the occasional anonymous threat. By the end of the week, the mayor had called a town hall meeting to address the growing unrest, and Mark knew he would be a focal point of the discussion. The night of the meeting arrived quickly. Mark sat at the back of the packed community center, his heart pounding as he listened to speaker after speaker take the podium. Some residents voiced their outrage, demanding his resignation and accusing the police force of systemic abuse of power. Others defended him, arguing that he was being unfairly vilified based on a short, out-of-context video. The room crackled with tension, the air thick with division. Mark's turn to speak came at the end of the night. As he walked to the front of the room, the murmur of voices quieted, replaced by a heavy silence. He cleared his throat, gripping the edge of the podium to steady himself. "Good evening," he began, his voice unsteady but determined. "I've served this community for over 15 years, and I've always tried to uphold the values of fairness, respect, and accountability. I know the video that's been circulating has raised a lot of questions, and I understand why people are upset. I want to say that my actions that night were not motivated by malice or prejudice. They were a mistake, a moment of frustration that I deeply regret." Before he could continue, a voice from the back of the room cut through the silence. "A mistake isn't good enough." It was James Hayes, standing tall and commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. "We've heard this script before, officers apologizing after the fact, but where's the accountability? Where's the real change?" Mark left the Hayes residence with a new sense of purpose but also a profound heaviness in his chest. As he drove back to the station, his mind raced with questions. How had he missed such critical details that night? Why had he been so quick to dismiss Emma's fear and defiance as mere teenage rebellion? The answers were unsettling but undeniable: bias, frustration, and complacency. He had allowed them to cloud his judgment, and now he had to face the consequences. Back at the station, Mark requested access to the incident report from that night. The names of the boys had been recorded when their IDs were checked, but no follow-up had been conducted since Mark had sent them on their way. He began digging into their records, looking for anything that might connect them to a pattern of harassment or similar behavior. Sure enough, within minutes, he found what he had dreaded: complaints filed by other students against 2 of the boys for bullying, stalking, and inappropriate behavior. Mark's stomach churned as he realized how badly he had mishandled the situation. He couldn't undo his failure that night, but he could still take action to hold the boys accountable. He compiled his findings into a report and took it directly to his superior, Captain Riley. The older man listened quietly as Mark explained the details, his face growing darker with every word. "This is a mess, Trenton," Riley said finally, leaning back in his chair. "And not just for you, for the whole department. You know this is going to blow up even bigger if it gets out, right?" Mark nodded. "I know, sir. But it's the right thing to do. We can't ignore this." Riley studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right. I'll open an investigation into the boys. But you'd better be ready for the fallout, because this isn't going to end with just them. People are going to ask why you didn't act sooner." Mark accepted the rebuke silently. He deserved it. As Riley began making calls to initiate the investigation, Mark returned to his desk, determined to do more. He reached out to Emma's school counselor and asked to set up a meeting with her and her family. If he was going to make amends, he needed to hear from Emma directly about what she needed to feel safe and supported. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at the high school. When Mark arrived, he was met with wary glances from the staff, a reminder of how far his reputation had fallen. He was ushered into a small conference room where Emma and James were already waiting, along with Mrs. Carter, the school counselor. Emma's expression was guarded, and James's was unreadable. Mark took a deep breath before sitting down across from them. "Thank you for meeting with me," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know I've let you down, and I'm here to listen and to learn how I can help make this right." Emma didn't respond immediately. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she spoke. "You can't change what happened that night," she said quietly. "But you can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Mark nodded. "That's exactly what I want to do. The boys who harassed you are being investigated, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure they face consequences. But I also want to hear from you. What do you need to feel safe? What can I do to regain your trust?" Emma hesitated, then glanced at her father. James gave her a small nod, and she turned back to Mark. "I want you to talk to other officers," she said. "Tell them what you did wrong. Teach them to look beyond their assumptions and actually listen to people. Maybe if you can change the way they think, what happened to me won't happen to someone else." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. Emma's request was simple but profound. She wasn't asking for revenge or even an apology, she was asking for systemic change, for a commitment to do better. "I can do that," he said, his voice firm. "I'll start with my own team, and I'll push for training that addresses these issues across the department." Emma nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. And one more thing, I want you to stay away from me and my family unless it's about the case. I need space to feel safe again." Mark's heart sank, but he understood. "Of course," he said. "I'll respect your boundaries." As the meeting ended, Mark felt a strange mix of emotions. He was grateful for the chance to make amends, but he also knew that rebuilding trust would take time and effort. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The investigation into the boys uncovered more evidence of their harassment, including threatening messages they had sent to other students. They were arrested and charged, their actions sparking a broader conversation in the community about bullying and accountability. Mark began giving talks at the station, sharing his experience with other officers and advocating for changes in training and policies. The process was humbling, but it also felt purposeful. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was making a difference. Meanwhile, the Hayes family began to heal in their own way. Emma returned to school with a newfound sense of confidence, bolstered by the knowledge that her voice had made an impact. James continued to speak out about issues of power and accountability, using his platform to advocate for change not just in Crestwood but beyond. Their story became a catalyst for broader reform, shining a light on the importance of empathy and understanding in law enforcement. For Mark, the journey was far from over. He still faced criticism and skepticism, and he knew that some wounds would never fully heal. But he also knew that he couldn't let his mistakes define him. Every day was an opportunity to do better, to learn, and to serve his community with the integrity and compassion it deserved. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As time passed, the ripples of that fateful night continued to spread through Crestwood, shaping lives and forging paths in unexpected ways. For Mark, the journey of self-reflection and redemption was ongoing. Each day brought new challenges, but also opportunities to rebuild the trust he had lost, not just with the Hayes family but with the entire community. Yet, even as progress was made, the specter of that night still loomed in his thoughts, a constant reminder of how quickly a moment of poor judgment could unravel so much. One morning, Mark received a call from Captain Riley. It wasn't unusual for his superior to summon him, but the tone in Riley's voice suggested something more significant. "Trenton, get to my office," Riley had said, short and to the point. "We've got a situation." Mark's pulse quickened as he made his way to the station. When he arrived, Riley was standing by the window, his expression stern. On his desk was a thick file folder marked confidential. Mark sat down, his nerves taut. "We've received word from state authorities," Riley began, turning to face him. "The investigation into the boys who harassed Emma has uncovered ties to something much bigger." Mark leaned forward, his brows knitting in confusion. Bigger? What do you mean? They weren't just harassing girls for sport, Riley explained, his voice heavy. They were part of an online group. It started as a forum for jokes and pranks, but it's evolved into something darker. They've been coordinating acts of targeted harassment, not just in Crestwood but in neighboring towns as well. Mark felt a chill run through him. The implications were staggering. What he had initially dismissed as teenage mischief had turned out to be part of a more sinister pattern. He couldn't shake the thought of how close Emma had come to being a victim of something far worse. "We need someone to spearhead the local end of this investigation," Riley continued. "Someone who understands the stakes and who's already invested in seeing this through. That's why I'm assigning you." Mark blinked in surprise. "Me? After everything that's happened, are you sure that's a good idea?" Riley's gaze was steady. "You made a mistake, but you've owned up to it, and you've shown that you're willing to do the work to make things right. This is your chance to prove it." Mark nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes." The next few weeks were intense. Mark worked closely with a task force to trace the origins of the group and identify its members. They pored over chat logs, social media posts, and digital footprints, piecing together a web of connections that spanned several communities. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the findings became. The group wasn't just a collection of bored teenagers, it included adults who manipulated the younger members, encouraging them to escalate their behavior. Throughout the investigation, Mark found himself haunted by what could have happened to Emma if he hadn't stepped in that night, or worse, if he had ignored the Hayes family's call for accountability. He was determined to ensure that no one else would have to go through what they did. Meanwhile, the Hayes family was finding their own ways to move forward. Emma had become a quiet but powerful voice for change, sharing her story in interviews and at community events. She was hesitant at first, but her father's encouragement and the outpouring of support from her peers gave her the confidence to speak out. Her bravery resonated with others, inspiring a wave of activism among students and parents alike. James, too, had taken on a more prominent role. He began working with local leaders to implement reforms in schools and police departments, focusing on education and training to prevent abuses of power. His military background gave him credibility, but it was his unwavering commitment to justice that truly set him apart. He and Mark crossed paths occasionally at community meetings, their interactions polite but tinged with unspoken tension. While James respected Mark's efforts to atone, the wounds from that night would take time to heal fully. As the investigation reached its climax, Mark and the task force identified the ringleaders of the group. Arrests were made, and charges were filed, sending a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. The operation was a success, but for Mark, it was only the beginning. He knew that dismantling the group was one step in a larger battle against the culture that had allowed it to thrive. The aftermath of the case brought a mix of emotions. Mark was lauded for his role in the investigation, but he remained grounded, knowing that his redemption was far from complete. He continued to push for changes within the department, advocating for mandatory training on bias and de-escalation techniques. Slowly, he began to see shifts in attitudes among his colleagues, small but meaningful signs of progress. One day, as Mark was leaving the station, he saw Emma and James outside, speaking with a reporter. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach them, but Emma caught his eye and gave him a small nod. It wasn't an invitation, but it was something, a sign that perhaps, over time, the barriers between them could be mended. Mark walked to his car, his thoughts heavy but hopeful. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was committed to walking it, one step at a time. He had learned the hard way that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about facing it, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for something better. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of peace, knowing that he was finally on the right path. Months turned into a year, and the events of that harrowing night became a defining chapter in Crestwood's history. For Mark, the lessons he had learned shaped not just his career but his entire outlook on life. Yet, despite his efforts to rebuild trust, he knew some wounds ran too deep to heal fully. The Hayes family remained polite but distant, and while Emma had acknowledged his commitment to change, the shadow of his initial failure lingered between them. One quiet evening, Mark found himself sitting on the back porch of his modest home, the crisp autumn air biting at his skin. His mind wandered to a letter he had received earlier that week, an invitation to speak at a statewide law enforcement conference about his experience. The idea of standing in front of hundreds of officers, admitting his failures, and sharing his journey was both daunting and humbling. Yet, he felt compelled to do it. If his story could prevent another officer from making the same mistakes, then it was worth the discomfort. The day of the conference arrived, and Mark stepped onto the stage under the glare of bright lights. The audience was a mix of seasoned officers, young recruits, and community leaders. As he began to speak, recounting the events of that pivotal night and the subsequent fallout, he felt the weight of their scrutiny. He didn't sugarcoat his actions or shy away from the hard truths. Instead, he emphasized the importance of empathy, accountability, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. The reaction was mixed. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others remained stoic, their expressions unreadable. But as Mark left the stage, he was approached by a young recruit who thanked him for his honesty. "I hope I never find myself in a situation like yours," the recruit said, "but if I do, I'll remember this." Back in Crestwood, life continued to shift in subtle but significant ways. The police department implemented new training programs focused on community engagement and implicit bias, thanks in part to Mark's advocacy. Schools introduced workshops on bullying and harassment, with Emma and other students leading discussions about their experiences. These changes, while incremental, marked a turning point for the town. One evening, Mark received an unexpected call from James Hayes. The sound of his deep voice on the other end of the line immediately put Mark on edge. "Officer Trenton," James began, his tone measured, "I wanted to let you know that Emma's been invited to speak at a national conference on youth advocacy. She's nervous about it, but I think it's a big step for her." "That's incredible," Mark replied sincerely. "She's going to make a real impact." James hesitated before continuing. "She mentioned that she'd like to include a perspective on how systems can change when people are willing to take responsibility for their actions. She was talking about you." Mark was stunned into silence. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "I'm honored." "Don't get me wrong," James added, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not saying everything's forgiven. But I've seen the work you've done, and so has she. It means something." The conversation ended on a tentative but hopeful note, and Mark felt a glimmer of relief. It wasn't redemption, not entirely, but it was a step forward. As Emma's conference approached, Mark threw himself into his work, continuing to mentor younger officers and advocate for systemic reforms. The department began to feel more cohesive, with officers increasingly open to discussing their biases and learning from one another. Mark's own transformation served as a testament to the power of accountability and change, and while he still faced critics, he found solace in the progress being made. When the day of Emma's speech arrived, Mark didn't expect to hear from her. But that evening, he received a text message from an unknown number. It was a photo of Emma on stage, holding a microphone, her expression confident and poised. The accompanying message was simple: "Thank you for listening. Emma." Mark stared at the screen for a long moment, a swell of emotion rising in his chest. He hadn't expected acknowledgement, let alone gratitude, but the message reaffirmed his commitment to the path he had chosen. It wasn't about erasing the past but about ensuring that it served as a foundation for growth, for himself, for Emma, and for the community. The months that followed were marked by continued progress. The boys who had harassed Emma faced their day in court, where they were held accountable for their actions. Their sentences included community service and mandatory counseling, a decision that reflected the town's desire for both justice and rehabilitation. The case became a touchstone for conversations about bullying, harassment, and accountability, not just in Crestwood but beyond. For Mark, the journey was far from over. He still carried the weight of his mistakes, but he had learned to channel that weight into something constructive. His relationships with the Hayes family remained fragile, but they were built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared commitment to change. One day, as Mark patrolled the familiar streets of Crestwood, he stopped at the community center where Emma and her friends were hosting a workshop for local teens. He watched from a distance as she spoke, her voice steady and her presence commanding. She was no longer the frightened girl he had failed to protect but a resilient young woman shaping the world around her. As Mark turned to leave, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He might never fully atone for his actions, but he had found purpose in the effort. And in the end, that purpose was enough to keep him moving forward.